first story, and round one for this week is on the US failure to extend the arms embargo on Iran at the Security Council. So last week we talked about how the Israel-UAE deal was in a way a win for Trump, at least in his mind, but that was quickly followed by an embarrassing defeat at the UN Security Council last Saturday, when the US only got one vote for in support by the Dominican Republic to extend an arms embargo on Iran. So now part of the 2015 nuclear deal that was signed with Iran, on 18th of October of this year, an arms embargo was supposed to be lifted on Iran on traditional conventional weapons, and the US was trying to extend that. But they didn't manage to get any support for it. This was very embarrassing. And from the get-go, the Trump administration started saying that, okay, well, we're going to use this snapback mechanism. So the snapback mechanism pretty much allows them to put in a complaint at the UN Security Council, which they did on Thursday of this week, asking and complaining that the Iran has been in violation of the nuclear deal, and therefore we need to bring all the sanctions back. So if this complaint is not countered by other Security Council members, and even if it is, it's unclear what the next steps are, then the US could possibly veto it. But if nothing is done in the next 30 days and they fail to reach some kind of resolution, this snapback mechanism that the US has initiated would not only bring back an embargo, impose an embargo on conventional weapons on Iran, but apparently bring back all the sanctions that were lifted as part of the 2015 deal. Now, using this snapback mechanism has been criticized by, of course, not only parties like Iran and Russia and China, but also the European Union. And funny enough, interestingly, John Bolton, the former national security advisor, super hawkish advisor Donald Trump, pro-war with Iran, he came out and saying, no, I don't think we should use a snapback mechanism because A, we are no longer part of the Iran deal, we retreated, and it is not going to look good. It's going to cause a lot of problems at the UN Security Council. Well, of course, he's probably saying this because since him and Trump fell apart, he's just been criticizing Trump and has been one of the more successful Republicans and right-wingers, I would say, to criticize Trump. So, I mean, his comments can really be attributed to that. But before I ask your opinion on everything that's happened, Sam, is there any part of the timeline or any details that I either messed up or you think we should add to give more context to this story?
No, not really. I do think we should emphasize that uh, pretty much the European signatories to the deal have, I mean, somewhat surprisingly come out against the US move quite as strongly. I was a bit surprised by how strong they came out of it. But no, I think that pretty much you explain everything. Um, the basics of the story is what you said.
Okay, so let's forget about the snapback for a second. Let's go back to last Saturday. How significant was this defeat for the US, you think? Or was it not even significant or that important?
From the reports I read on online sources, AP, Reuters, and all that, they argued that it was pretty embarrassing because it was a very bad defeat. Or their resolution to against Iran, because apparently US has spent quite a lot of political capital trying to convince some of the smaller states like Estonia, if I'm not mistaken, but they couldn't even manage to get more than one nation, which was, if I'm not mistaken, Dominican Republic, or maybe it was similar. Anyway, but so in terms of like the efforts they put in, they got very little, because at least if they managed to get 6, 7 nations to vote with them, even though Russia and China would have vetoed it, they still could have said they isolated them on the international stage, but they got isolated themselves basically. That's what happened. But that, I mean, the defeat was likely, but to that defeat, so to get defeated so badly. I think that was very embarrassing to them. So that's my. I don't know. What do you think it was a? I mean, I from what I remember from our last week discussion, I think you agree that it was a pretty embarrassing defeat as well, right?
No, definitely, I think so too. And yeah, and it was the Dominican Republic. They're a temporary member of the
Mhm.
Security Council right now. And yes, I think so. I mean, one other thing that came out is that, of course, just like you said, Russia and China didn't even have to use their veto power or anything. Nobody voted in favor of this except the Dominican Republic. So I think until then, and it seems like now they have to resort to this snapback, which did you also hear that it's never been used at the UN Security Council or that it's rarely used? Did you hear
Well,
any?
it's yeah, I mean, it's the part of the Iran, US, and other countries' deal. So, I mean, naturally, it has never been used. But I mean, the legal. That's what I was going to ask you actually about the current problem, because from what I understand, there is a. I mean, one report described it as because the deal is very badly written. But the problem is that U.S. claims uh, to have what do you say triggered the snapback mechanism, right? But the Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese and Iranians, obviously, they argue that because U.S. isn't part of the deal anymore, they can't trigger it. So, like I mean, you said in 30 days the sanctions gonna come back. Well, the issue right now is that the triggering of the snapback isn't recognized by other members of the Security Council, other signatories to the deal. And so I don't know legally where do we like U.S. threatening, other countries, not the Security Council countries, that they will continue to, impose the sanctions. But yeah, it's a very interesting. I think since the creation of UN, this is the biggest, at least the biggest legal technical challenge that they might face if US continues to, insist on its stance that because it's one of the because US is not part of the deal anymore. They came out of the deal, but because security councils are technically are the ones that have the responsibility to enforce the deal, US is claiming it is still can trigger the snapback mechanism. So legally speaking, it's fascinating. I'm sure the legal people who are in international law and stuff, they find it very interesting right now because it genuinely can be the weirdest and strangest challenge to UN Security Council authority since its creation.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And if you read any news article, I mean, it's so clear that it's very vague on what's going to happen. So on the US Pompeo side, of course, they're super confident and they're saying in 30, 31 days all the sanctions will come back. But of course, it's unclear what's going to happen until then. The most clear-cut thing I've read, which is, let's say, if they're allowed to use the snapback exactly, if it's a legal procedure that they're able to do, let's say they use it, and then after that, the only way to counter it is that Russia or China or another member of the council can put in a resolution, but then the US could veto that resolution, and by doing that, then that's it. That
No, no, no.
reaches the end game. That's what I heard. If things go according to the way they're saying.
Yeah, but that's you're right. That would have been the case if if US was legally allowed to trigger the mechanism. But right now, the issue is even more fundamental than that. The issue is is US legally allowed to trigger that mechanism? And I don't know which even like this who would answer that question because the situation as it seems to be evolving is that because international law is largely, at least in trade, is enforced by US, Russia, China, the big guys. So it would be quite interesting. We can see basically a very similar situation to the height of the Cold War, where certain nations operate by certain rules and certain nations operate by certain other rules. So yeah, but if if US insists on UN complying with its interpretation, then you're right. That's the situation that we're gonna face probably. Well, it's fascinating stuff right now. I don't. Did you hear about that's example of the, by the way, things we might face? Did you hear about the Iranian uh, petrol being seized? Well, Iran was sending petrol on ships to Venezuela. Like, I mean, I'm not sure how much of it was economical, how much of it was a political sort of act of defiance against
For the
US.
for the past few weeks, right? This you're referring to like the past month, pretty much, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think 2 weeks ago this happened, if I'm not mistaken. And then the ships were the initial report said the ships were seized by U.S. forces. Uh, then at first Iran denied it, but then apparently what has happened was that they didn't seize the ships, but they negotiated with the crew and the captain to have the petrol moved to American ships or American controlled ships. So they seized the petrol. They didn't seize the ships per se. So, this is the type of situation we might face a lot if US insists on continuing on its path. That basically where US can, it enforces its own rules, and where it can't, Iran operates freely. But yeah, Iran called it, I think, act of uh, piracy, and there was not much international reaction to it. But it's gonna, if it happens, something like that happens near China or something, situation can escalate. Who knows?
That's very interesting. So you're kind of using that example as if the U.S. kind of starts following its own rules, the rest of the countries of Security Council are not following it, then the U.S. will only have areas where it can unilaterally work to impose or enforce sanctions on Iran.
Yeah, yeah. And I will add that it will increase chances of a, more major conflict. Maybe perhaps, people might start using their guns, and God knows what happens next. So it's not a good development.
And Trump doesn't have much time. I mean, the
Oh
elections
no.
are in 3 months.
No, no, I don't think this is gonna happen in the next 3 months or anything. But yeah, I wonder what do you think is gonna happen in the next 3 months? Because I don't think he's gonna get a big win out of this, and I don't think international politics doesn't isn't that important in elections. I don't think anyway. What do you think?
No, again, I mean, I think we mentioned this last week. We're probably going to talk about it some more during the Democratic Convention segment that we have. But I think things have never been, well, at least for the past few elections that I've been following, it hasn't been so clear what the main issues are. And it's all about against Trump and for Trump. It really seems like to me, as well as the state of the economy, which pretty much adds to that layer, given what happened with coronavirus and the pandemic. So, especially an international foreign policy issue like this should not change much. The only way it can change anything is if Trump, let's say, gets a really good, some kind of victory around this that he can publicize and promote very well. But then again, I don't think it's an issue that's on the mind of American voters.
No, I mean, I would, I go a bit further than you, and from my experience from the, historical records, I think everywhere in the world you can see that global issues, international politics, foreign affairs, none of it really matters to the local people unless it becomes directly connected, like the American wars in the Middle East and a lot of soldiers dying. As soon as the wars become like Cold Wars, or they become, used they use missiles and technology. People don't see or don't seem to care too much. I don't think it's going to have a very positive effect on Trump's campaign. But yeah, but it's very interesting right now. We are in new territory in terms of international law and everything. So, it's interesting to see what's gonna happen. I wonder. I really wonder.
No, that's so true. And if this issue was over any other country except Iran, then it would even have less value. I mean, that's probably the fact that it has to do with Iran has a lot to do with the attention that it's getting.
Sure, sure, sure. But I mean, to be fair, though, I would say the legal problem that now U.S. and China and Russia face. That's I don't know. It's first of all, it's a very new, and I do think it's the serious challenge to the UN Security Council authority and the way it's functioned, like who's in charge or whatever. At the same time, it's quite symbolic of the whole U.S. China and to a lesser extent Russia rivalry at right now. It's literally, and Iran is right exactly in the middle of traditional maps. Of course, maps are, constructed, but in traditional maps, Iran is right in the middle of America and China as well. So the whole thing is very symbolic, I think.
And to add to that, even there's also the Europeans, and I mean, they're without saying so, they're clearly siding with China and Russia, not because they want to side with them, but because they've wanted to implement this deal as much as possible. And I think they really want to normalize relations with Iran as much as possible. Really, the only party that seems to have major problems with the Iran, or at least they don't want to go through the nuclear deal route, is the US. So the Europeans are also in an interesting position here.
Well, I would say Europeans have been smartly, in my view, been playing both sides, though. While they have in rhetoric and in, basically in their official, official announcements, they pretty much take Iran's sides when it comes to this deal. In terms of actually doing something or actually financially helping Iran or taking Iran's sides on security issues, they haven't really done much. They tend to take USS sides when it comes to Middle East security and like Iran's ballistic missile testing and all that. So they've been, and they are in it, they're not as independent as Russia or China from US.
100%, but I think that's because exactly they can't get into some kind of serious confrontation with the US over this. I mean, the US is still one of the is the biggest market, I believe, for EU goods. They know how Trump would react, then they're gonna have to get into some kind of trade war with the US over this for at least 2 months or however long Trump would feel like doing so. So I think the Europeans, of course, they're not going to be too confrontational. But I think if it was up to them and the US would go, hey, you decide war with Iran or not war with Iran, they'll be like, yeah, please, no war with Iran for now. We prefer doing business.
I definitely agree. I will add that besides the fact that US is the biggest market for European products, is the fact that many European companies they have a significant number of American shareholders, or at least US based shareholders. So their economies is much more integrated than the China and Chinese and Russian economy. So it's just they're simply not as independent from US. They're much more connected. But yeah, during the next month, though, it's going to be very interesting to see who's going to basically prevail in Security Council. If we're going to have a Security Council, maybe they disband the whole thing like the League of Nations. Who knows?
Yeah. I want to speculate on this a bit more, but I don't feel like there's any need because this story is not gonna go away. But that is what if the US gets his way, what that means for the Iranian nuclear deal. But I think we can save that for a later time.
Yeah, I definitely agree because At the moment, I can't even find much commentary from like experts on the what's gonna happen next, on the more experienced experts. Not that we are not experts, but well, yeah, we can leave that to later time, I think.